Tantor Audio presents Wheel of the Infinite by Martha Wells. Narrated by Lisa Reneé Pitts. Chapter 1. Maskell had been asking the ancestors to stop the rain 3 days running now, and, as usual, they weren't listening. She stood on a little hill, surrounded by the heavy jungle that lined either side of the river of mud that had once been the road, and watched the wagons crawl painfully by. They were wooden and brightly painted, but the roofs hadn't been tarred in too long, and she knew it was hardly any drier inside them than out. One of the oxen, straining to keep the wheels moving forward against the tide of mud, moaned loudly. I sympathize, Maskell thought. Rastim, leader of the little troop, stumbled up the hill toward her, his boots squelching and his clothes a sodden mess. He paused a short distance from her and said, "Oh, great protectress, why is it we're going to Duvalpore?" Maskell leaned on her staff. "Because I said so." "Oh." Rastim contemplated the wagons thoughtfully, then looked down at his shirt, where the downpour was making the cheap dyes of the embroidery run, and sighed heavily. Maskell would have promised him better if she made promises. He glanced at her, brows lifted. "So there's no chance of just stopping and drowning here, say?" "No, I think we'll keep moving for now, and drown a little further up the road." "Ah," he nodded. "Then can you come and take another look at Killia's poppet? She thinks she's worse." Maskell rolled her eyes to the ancestors. Rastim was an Ariadan, and they never believed in giving bad news without a lot of preamble, no matter how urgent it was. She started down the hill and plunged back into the mud river. Killia's wagon was painted with geometric designs in bright red and yellow, now splattered with dirt from the long journey. Maskell caught the handhold at the back and stepped up onto the running board, which barely cleared the soupy mud. She knocked on the shutter, and it was immediately cranked upward. Killia extended a hand to help her in, and Maskell discovered she needed it. Her light cotton robes were so drenched that they added an unexpected amount to her weight. She sat on the bench just inside the entrance so she could wring them out a bit and wait for her eyes to adjust to the dark interior. Various wooden bowls caught the leaks from the roof, but there were still puddles on the lacquered floor. Overhead, cooking pots banged into empty cage lamps and the bags that held costumes and drapes for the scenery, bundled up to keep them out of the water. Killia's daughter was huddled in one of the 2 narrow bunks under a mound of damp blankets. Maskell leaned over and burrowed in the blankets until she touched warm skin. Too warm, she swore under her breath. "Bad?" Killia asked. She was a tiny woman with the pale skin of the Ariadan and long dark hair caught back by a number of clips and ribbons. Her face had the perfection of a porcelain doll's, and to Maskell she looked hardly more than a child herself, but her eyes were old. Maskell shook her head. The priesthood took oaths to the truth, but she had broken all her oaths long ago, and Killia had enough to worry about. "I'll have to go down to the river for some more ivy bray. The real river, not the one under the wagon." Killia smiled briefly at the feeble joke. "Ivy bray for lung rot?" "Ivy bray is good for any fever, not just lung rot. The girl doesn't have lung rot," Maskell told her, and thought, not yet. Anyway. Killia didn't look reassured. Maskell gathered her sodden robes and jumped down off the wagon bed. Rastim had been walking behind it, and the spray of mud as she landed splattered both of them. They eyed each other in mutual understanding. It had been one of those days. She said, "Camp in the Sair if you can make it before dark. If you're not there, I'll look for you along the road." He swept her a theatrical bow. "Yes, oh, great protectress." "You're welcome, Rastim," Maskell said, and splashed toward the heavy dark wall of the jungle. 2 hours later, Maskell wasn't so sanguine herself. The thick clouds made the night fall faster under the jungle canopy, and though the broad-leaf palms protected her from heavy rain, the going was still laboriously slow. She reached the river while the jungle was still a deep green cave, dripping and quiet, and stood on the bank to watch the swollen waters. The river was running high and drunk on its own power, gray with mud and crested with foam. It was the source of wild magic, especially as bloated with rain and powerful as it was now. It would be a channel for any dark influence that cared to use it. It was none of her business. Maskell shook her head. "Keep telling yourself that." The ivy brae proved annoyingly elusive. Usually it grew at the very edge of the tree line above the river, but there were no patches to be found in the usual spots, and she found herself having to slide dangerously down the muddy bank. By the time she had picked a quantity and scrambled back up to more solid ground, the green cavern had become a pitch-black hole. She decided to make her way along the river until she was at the right point to strike out for the road again. She stumbled along, barefoot because no pair of sandals would have lasted half a day in this mess, her patched robes tied up to keep her from tripping, a bundle of stinking ivy brae crammed under her belt, and covered with mud from feet to nose. Her braids kept falling into her eyes, and some were fraying apart, revealing how much gray was mixed in with the dark strands. Smiling, she wondered what the court of Cuchulainn at Duvalpore would have thought of her now. Not much. Not much, she chuckled to herself. Rastim was right. Their luck was so bad it was beginning to be funny. Perhaps it was the ancestors, tired of her importunities at last, willing to drown the whole of the great road just to inconvenience her poor self. Maskell smiled at the thought. Add hubris to the list of crimes, if it wasn't there already. The twilight had deepened into night now, and the river was a menacing roar to her right. She saw a flicker of light ahead along the bank. Staggering toward it, sodden and chilled, she hoped that it was a river trader's outpost, and that there might be such a thing as a cup of warm tea before she had to walk back through the jungle to the road. Or maybe a half bottle of rice wine. I'm getting old, she thought sourly, but that was nothing new. As she drew closer to the light, she could hear raucous voices, a great many raucous voices. She was close enough now for the lamps lit along the balconies to show her the outline of the place. It perched on the edge of the bank, wooden and ramshackle, half of it hanging out over the rushing river and supported by heavy log pilings. Several small boats were tied up under it, and splintered wood, rope, torn sail, and the wreckage of fish traps were caught among them and the pilings. The windows glowed with light, and many people moved about inside. It's a trader's outpost, true enough, she thought, but it doesn't belong to river traders. Not any longer. Raiders and river pirates must be using it for the night, though they couldn't have been here long. Imperial patrols would periodically sweep the riverbanks to clear them out. She hadn't seen any boat traffic on the river, but had put that down to the rain and rough water. She let out her breath in resignation. Raiders were as vicious as the moray, the small lizards that hunted the river in packs. Not only drunken laughter came from the inhabitants of the outpost, there were shrieks, thumps, crashes, even roars, like a menagerie. Common sense told her to head into the jungle so she could get back to make the posset for Killia's girl and retire to her own cold supper and damp bed. But this kind of thing had been her business, in one way or another, for many long years, and old habits die hard. There was a crash as a body came flying through the latticework of one of the windows over the dock. That decided her. This she had to see. She walked up the rickety steps to the nearest doorway and elbowed her way inside. The place was full of river trash, as filthy and muddy as Mescal herself, except river trash were usually filthy and muddy by choice. Their clothes were tattered rags or pillaged finery, like the tom silk trousers and vest of one lying unconscious on the floor. They stunk of uncured leather, unwashed person, and rice liquor, and the bad light reflected off sweat-slickened skin and wild, dirty hair. They packed the rickety wooden gallery that ran along this floor and even staggered around in drunken battle on the lower level, which was awash in dirty water as the rising river encroached on it. Every one of them was yelling like the mad. The resemblance to the court at Duvalpore is striking, Mescal thought, watching them ironically. She winced from the din and considered leaving. The place was so smoky from the badly tended lamps that she couldn't see what was happening anyway. Swearing under her breath, she looked toward the far end of the gallery, where there was a raised platform for the upper-level loading deck. The giant pulleys and tangled ropes of the old cargo crane hung heavily over it, the arms suspended out over the lower floor, designed to raise bales through the wide doors that opened over the river in the wall behind the deck, swing them inside the building, and lower them down to the large area below. Several people seemed to be standing and talking there in almost a sane manner. She started toward them, trying to peer through the smoke and shadow. Frustration made her will it a little too hard, for her view abruptly cleared. Ah, so they've caught someone. The prisoner's arms were stretched up over his head, his wrists bound to one of the supports for the crane. One of the raiders came toward him, and he jerked up his legs and kicked his captor in the stomach, sending him flying backward. Not quite helpless, she thought, amused. Two other rivermen dived at him, grabbing his legs and lashing him to the lower part of the frame. He was probably a traveler trapped and caught somewhere along the river. That was why the ancestors had guided her steps here. So I'm not too disobedient to make use of, she grumbled to herself, making her way down the crowded gallery and clearing a path with occasional sharp pokes from her staff. The raiders were beginning to point and nudge each other, her presence finally penetrating the haze of liquor and bloodlust. Because of the tattered state of her clothes and her staff, they would think her a traveling nun. Unless they could read the Koshin symbols in the silver embedded in the wood, and she doubted that was a possibility. Mescal looked around thoughtfully. She didn't think she could kill all of them, and she had taken an oath not to do that sort of thing anymore, but she thought she could manage a distraction. One of the rivermen standing on the platform was holding a sword, a real one, not one of the long knives the other raiders were armed with. The greasy light reflected off the dark etching on the wavy blade, and Mescal frowned a little. That was a Siri. The bright work on the hilt wasn't much tarnished yet, so it must have come from the prisoner. It meant he wasn't native to the river country. Several of the southern provinces used the Siri, and it wasn't common here in the heart of the lowlands. The Kusharit, the main stock of the Celestial Empire, also tended to be small, dark-skinned, and compactly built, and the prisoner was tall, light, rangy, lean, and sharp-featured. Mescal was an aberration herself, having outer reaches blood in her family and being tall and long-limbed because of it. He was about 10 or 15 years younger than Mescal, which she was uncomfortably aware, still made him a man grown. He wore a sleeveless shirt and leather leggings, torn and dirty from what had obviously been a hard battle, and the blue and red designs stamped into his leather sword belt and buskins had faded from long exposure to the sun. His hair was shaggy brown with streaks of blonde, and one long, tightly braided lock hung past his shoulder. The river raiders wore assorted scraps of leather or lacquered armor and tattered silk finery. The woman, who seemed to be the leader, had a battered helmet with a crest shaped into the head of a killing bird, obviously taken off some wealthy victim. She was big and muscular, an old knife scar slashing across already harsh features. She strode to the edge of the platform and glared down at Mescal. "What do you want here, sister?" "Yes, you're so terribly dangerous," Mescal thought, smiling indulgently. "I tremble. Really, I do." Dangling over the platform, the ropes to control the crane were worn and tangled, and it looked like the counterweight, a leather sack of iron ingots, was the only thing that was keeping the massive wooden arm from collapsing. "That will do nicely." She leaned on her staff. "I come to offer blessing, my child." The woman stared, then grinned back at her companions. "We're unbelievers here, sister. We'd curdle your blessing." "Not this blessing. It's just what your sort deserve." Mescal felt a dark surge of power under her feet as she spoke. The river was restless with more than floodwater tonight. It called to her, sensing a kinship. "But I want something in exchange for it." "What's that?" "Release that man." The prisoner was watching her warily, without any show of hope, almost as if he didn't recognize her as a Koshin. He didn't look badly hurt, however, just bruised and beaten. "Oh, so you want him for yourself, sister?" the leader said. The others laughed and grinned at each other. "If you don't consider the source, it's not a bad idea," Mescal thought. He was handsome in an exotic way, which was probably why the raiders had saved him to amuse themselves with, rather than killing him immediately. The Koshins only demanded abstinence from initiates during the first 3 years of instruction, but it was a common misconception that all members of the order were celibate. Before Mescal could answer, the prisoner said, "She doesn't need a club to get company. Some women don't." He spoke in Kusharit, the common language of the empire, but lightly accented. Mescal frowned. She should be able to tell what province he was from by that accent, but she couldn't place it. She had been too long from her native land, perhaps, too long among the soft voices of Ariad. The fact that he knew Kusharit was no real clue. It was a common language throughout the provinces, too, spoken by traders, scholars, diplomats. The leader crossed the stained planks to step close to her captive. She grabbed a handful of his hair and jerked his head back. "So you don't like my face?" she said softly. I wager she didn't do that before he was more securely bound. Mescal tended to find male bullies merely amusing, but for some reason the female ones always stirred her to rage. "Careful, careful," she reminded herself. The darkness in the river was so uncontrolled, so near, so willing to be tapped, it was hard to resist the temptation. Voice slightly constricted from the pressure the leader was putting on his neck, he still said, "Your face I could ignore. It's your personality and your breath that turn my stomach." This time Mescal placed the accent. He was from the Sintain. It was a province far on the outer rim, known for fine-figured gold work and weaving. He was a long way from home. The Sintain didn't have deserters or mercenaries like the other provinces. They had outcasts. She looked at the sword the raider was holding. The hilt might be horn or bone, and the ring between the blade and the hilt seemed to be plain silver, all of which told her nothing. The Sitanese sometimes carved family totems into the hilts of Siri, and the ring was often an elaborate piece of jeweler's art. Mescal said, "You must be terribly afraid of him." One of the raiders gave a short bark of laughter, and the leader released her grip on the captive to face Mescal. "What are you saying?" "If you aren't afraid, then cut him loose and let him fight your men. if you call them men. The leader came to the edge of the platform and pushed her face close to Maskel's. She growled, "I should feed you to the moray, Koshin bitch." Seen at close range, her scar was an ugly, puckered fissure across a face webbed with fine lines and darkened with ingrained dirt. The woman was bigger than Maskel, much younger, all hard muscle, but Maskel felt no fear. Her blood was singing with the urge to kill. She rocked forward on the balls of her feet, looked into the other woman's glaring eyes, and said with utter seriousness, "The moray would choke." Even that was almost too much. If she said one more word, the dam would break and her rage would find an outlet, whether she willed it or not. Physical threats always made her lose her temper. In all the years, that had never changed. The raider blinked, suddenly uncertain, perhaps sensing the danger but not wise enough to realize just what the source was. She stepped back slowly, fingering the hilt of her knife. Maskel waited, smiling, but the woman shook her head and laughed. "Do as she says. Let him fight." She gestured to the men behind her. Maskel took a deep breath that the others probably read as relief. It was part disappointment, part attempt to hold on to her suddenly tenuous self-control. One of the raiders stepped forward, drawing his long belt knife. The prisoner tensed, and Maskel held her breath. If they changed their minds now, there was nothing she could do about it. But the raider slashed the man's bonds and stepped quickly back. The prisoner freed himself from the rest of the ropes, looked around at the raiders, and with admirable self-possession stretched and rubbed his neck. He caught Maskel's eye, and she flicked a glance at the gallery railing behind her, wondering if he would pick up on the hint. She needed the raider's attention to be away from the cargo doors and the crane. He didn't nod, didn't indicate that he had seen her signal, but he suddenly dropped to the platform and kicked the kneecap of the raider who held the captured Suri. The man collapsed with a shriek, his leg giving way with a sharp crack. The prisoner came to his feet, taking the sword easily from the raider's shaking hand, ducked a deadly swipe from a bory club as he passed Maskel, and vaulted over the gallery railing. She leaned over it in time to see him catch an old net that hung over the side and swing down to drop into the water, washing over the lower floor. The gallery audience roared, the leader and her lieutenant shouting and cursing as they ran for the railing. Down on the floor below, the waving mass of combatants broke into little whirling eddies. In the instant of stillness, she saw several rivermen with knives or bory clubs surrounding the one man armed with a sword. The blade flashed, and the rivermen scattered. Perhaps it was the rivermen who were trapped now, and not the traveler. Bemused, Maskel watched the leaping, dodging figures. It was like a game, or an entertainment so primitive it looked like violence to eyes long accustomed to the sophistication of Ariadne or Curati theater. The prisoner wasn't wielding that blade with deadly intent yet. The plank floor below was awash in dirty water as the rising river encroached on the lower level of the outpost, but not high enough to conceal the dead bodies that would surely be sprawled there if he was. Maskel knew if he killed some of them, that would only fire the others to more fury. It was all or nothing. She was a little surprised he recognized that as well. The crowd pressed in again, trying to rush him, but their nerve failed, and they splashed away. "Well, sister, where's our blessing?" the leader demanded, trying to recover her control of the situation. Maskel tried to decide just which invocation would annoy the ancestors the most. The great opening, the signal part of the year rite, would get their immediate attention, and hearing the words of it on her lips, should elicit the quickest response. She turned away from the railing and stepped up onto the platform, clearing her mind. As Maskell faced the room and lifted her staff above her head, the raiders' leader called out, "Attend to the nun, you bastards!" She grinned derisively around at her companions. "She's going to give us a blessing." Some of the raiders turned toward this new diversion, but most were too occupied by the fighting to listen. A man, almost too drunk to stand on his feet, staggered up on the platform, muttering, "Kill the Koshin bitch!" Maskell swung her staff down and around, slamming him in the chest and sending him crashing backward off the platform. That got their attention. The shouts and drunken roaring died away. Into the relative quiet, Maskell said, "I am the voice of the adversary." She hadn't spoken loudly, but her words carried across the room. There were gasps and outcries, proving that some of the raiders at least were among the devout. One quick thinker turned and dived out the nearest window. The leader stared around, baffled and angry. Maskell spoke the first words of the great opening. This was too much presumption for the myriad forces of the infinite to ignore. All the lamps in this half of the chamber flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, Maskell swung around to the cargo doors and with the end of her staff threw the latch up. The doors flew open, and wind-driven rain rushed in. There were shrieks and shouts as the rivermen began to panic, shoving and pushing. Maskell stepped quickly to the crane's counterweight, drawing the little knife she used for cutting fruit. It was too small for the job, but she slashed at the half-rotted ropes until suddenly the counterweight dropped. The reaction was more violent than she had anticipated. The counterweight smashed right through the floorboards, knocking her backwards. The arm swung and toppled, taking the railing, part of the gallery, and a dozen yelling rivermen with it. "I meant to do that," Maskell muttered to herself, stumbling to her feet. The raiders must think the post was under attack by hostile river spirits. They were pouring out the door Maskell had entered by, blocking it, fighting and snarling like rats. Then a figure tore away from the over-panicked, shoving bodies and charged toward her, bory club upraised. It was the leader. Maskell met her with the end of her staff, catching the woman a hard blow in the stomach and pushing her away. She staggered back but didn't fall. She must have some sort of leather or lacquered wood chest armor under her silk vest. Maskell couldn't see much in the half-light, but she assumed the razor edge of the heavy wooden club was aimed toward her. She kept the staff pointed at the leader, braced to move. The other woman shuffled to the side, trying to get past Maskell's guard. Then Maskell saw that the ropes still attached to the broken crane arm and hanging over the gallery were jerking and twitching. It had to be the rivermen who had gone over the rail with the crane, still trapped in them. Then a head popped up over the edge. She knew who it was. The trapped traveler had had hair cropped at his shoulders, while the river raiders either shaved their heads to avoid lice or grew wild waist-length manes. Grinning, Maskell angled sideways, making poking motions with the staff as if she meant to try to break for the door across the gallery. Her opponent, thinking to catch her between herself and the packed door, obligingly stepped backward, closer to the edge. The traveler hauled himself further up, and when the raider stepped back into reach, he swung his sheathed sword around and struck the back of her knees. The woman toppled backwards with a choked-off cry. Maskell turned immediately for the cargo doors, using her staff to trip a flailing, foul-smelling shadow that tried to stop her. Rain and wind poured in, drenching the boards under her feet. She found the ropes for the winch, but they didn't move when she tugged on them. The other counterweight must be broken. Damn it, she thought, and tossed her staff out, hoping it struck the dock, not the river. She grabbed the heavy rope and swung out after it, getting a confused view of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?